Hi everyone, I'm Suma and here's Geoffrey Edwards. He's an author as well as a senior scientist with a background in physics and astrophysics.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for your time, Geoffrey. It means a lot to me.
I'm happy to be here. It's a fun context to exchange with you in this way. So,
And what I find really fascinating about your work is that you have covered such a wide spectrum, science as well as mysticism. So I think it would be really valuable to get your take on some of these concepts.
yeah, my science career was also very broad. I covered many different areas of science. So,
Yeah, I was looking at your website. Even within science, you have done some things which are kind of merge of fashion as well as science.
yes, that's an area that I'm still working on, smart garments and things like that. Yeah.
I was thinking first we could start with more science-based concepts, and then we could move on to your work, and then we can move on to the more Eastern philosophy-based mysticism.
Okay.
The first thing was I would love to get your take on quantum physics and what you think are some of the basic concepts of quantum physics that could be useful in everyday life.
So that's a good question. I've had arguments with people about that before. So just a bit of background. I'm not a quantum physicist, although I do have, I was actually trained as an astrophysicist. And so I have some background in quantum mechanics. And I've read fairly extensively about quantum physics, but I'm not really a specialist. But I'm probably more advanced than most lay people who are looking at the subject. And so, I mean, quantum physics, I noticed in your notes that you send me, is this tendency to view quantum physics as somehow distinct from standard science, but quantum physics is standard science. It's essentially the modern understanding of the world is a quantum physical understanding. The question then becomes is how does quantum physics get extended in the future into explaining areas that are currently difficult to explain. So this is the interest in applying or developing theories of quantum mechanics that embrace issues like consciousness. But currently, the evidence to do that is weak. There are suggestions that it could be done, but it's at this point largely speculation in terms of what could actually be used that way. However, in terms of applying quantum mechanics, there are interesting things about quantum mechanics in a way. So if the universe wasn't quantum, there wouldn't be much in the way of breaks in it. Quantum physics introduces this idea of quanta, which breaks up structures. And so without quantum physics, all behaviors and all things would be continuous. In a way, the universe couldn't exist. We couldn't exist in a universe that wasn't quantum. So in a sense, quantum physics is built into the way we are at a very deep level. Whether or not you can use it to explain the sort of higher level functioning of, say, consciousness or things like that is another question. But underneath, it's all quantum.
Does it kind of change the way we currently look at reality?
It certainly has changed the way we, but a lot of that has been heavily studied now. Maybe all of the consequences haven't been worked out, but the idea of the uncertainty principle that you can't entirely fix measurements in a precise manner, that you're forced to accept a certain level of uncertainty in measurement. That's built into, so these were difficult concepts for scientists to grasp at first, but they're now sort of constructed into modern science, is recognition of those limits. The sort of the role of consciousness or the role of choice. So this question of, for instance, entanglement issues, where different events that are separated in space and time can be quantumly linked, even though there may be large distances between them. And the idea that consciousness is needed to enact that kind of entanglement. The evidence doesn't show that exactly. It shows something unusual, but it's not consciousness per se, but it's some kind of choice or choosing function that doesn't have to be consciousness based, or one could conceive of non-consciousness based mechanisms. And so the idea that consciousness is necessarily involved in quantum phenomena, although it's widely discussed that way, is not necessarily the case.
So are ideas like where some people talk about how the screen gets generated only when you're looking on it, looking at it, is quantum physics kind of hinting towards that, where that virtual reality gets generated only when there is a viewer?
See, that's an interpretation. Part of the problem with quantum mechanics is there's a lot of room for interpretation, and how you determine how you decide what is going on in that kind of context is not determined by quantum physics. It's a choice one makes outside of quantum physics in terms of philosophy or the kinds of systems one used for interpretation. So for instance, the Bohr system of quantum physics is an interpretation of quantum physics. This is the one that's often used as a support for some of these consciousness links between quantum physics and conscious phenomenon. But it's an interpretation. It's not a law. It's not a set of laws. It's a set of interpretations. And the interpretations are grounded on certain ideas or principles behind them. So if you use Bohr theory, you get to one set of conclusions about these things, but you can use other sets of assumptions to get to different conclusions. So this idea that the consciousness invests or creates in some sense the world in which we live is one interpretation of what is going on in quantum physics, but it's not the only one. And the evidence isn't, I mean, there is no evidence really to distinguish between these different interpretations, not at this time anyway.
So is it fair to say that a lot of it is still to interpretation, and there's no solid conclusion about what's...
So the question in science is always, is it testable? And a lot of these phenomena are not easily testable. They are testable, but the measurements needed to test them are extremely difficult to develop. And we don't necessarily know how to do all the measurements. So it'll take, decades before some of these questions are resolved through measurement, and perhaps even centuries in some cases. It'll take a while, yeah.
And what is your input on when some people say that this may be a virtual reality or a simulation?
Well, my problem with that is that but more it's a kind of a gut feeling built out of my understanding of the world, is that I think the solution to consciousness, or the solution to what we call the problem of consciousness, which is where does consciousness come from, is fundamentally physical. It's not a question of, so there's this idea that even many scientists maintain today that we are essentially information machines, and that the way a human operates is a coding of information that's on a biological substrate, and that if you could replace that biological substrate with an electronic substrate, and you'd still get the same kind of epiphenomena in terms of consciousness if you did it right. I disagree with that. I think that's unlikely to be the case. I think the physicality of the world is required for consciousness, and that we're not going to get it going the sort of electronic artificial intelligence route in terms of reproducing a consciousness. So I'm the kind of science fiction writer who doesn't go, for instance, the idea that you can take a person's consciousness and move it to a different body. I think that's unlikely to be the way the world is. But it's hard to explain exactly why I think that. It's a collection of ideas that have developed and grown over the course of my career in the different areas that I work in.
So the idea of technological singularity, it seems, do you think that's unlikely to happen?
So it depends what you mean by the technological singularity. There are some people who propose that the singularity is that machines will get smarter than us and overtake. I think, as I say, I think that's unlikely. There are other people who suggest that the singularity is that the speed of change becomes too fast to keep track of. Now, that's something that might be possible. It's got nothing to do with consciousness per se, but simply the speed at which innovation happens. And it may get to a point where it's too hard to track. So that's a kind of singularity, and one that certain people in the sort of singularity, technological singularity world are discussing. And that I'm more inclined to think may be part of our future.
I think with my previous question, I was more trying to ask about, do you think that this is a more like solid physical matter-based reality? Is there more evidence pointing towards that? Or like when people talk about that, some scientists talk about like we may be in a simulation, is there evidence lining up towards that in terms, what's your take on that as a physicist?
Because a simulation requires a kind of information substrate, right? In which the simulation is, so it's this idea that we are in some sense informational processors. That this idea of virtual reality as a way of life is predicated on the idea, I think, of essentially information processing. But I don't think human beings are built that way at all. And I think we've moved ourselves into a corner, which is going to get harder and harder to defend by assuming that that human beings function in that way. Now, that doesn't mean to say that I think there isn't a place for the spiritual or the numinous within that. It's just that I think that those things are also grounded in the physical reality of the world and not in informational processing elements.
And when I was researching about this subject, there seems to be a general opinion that words like quantum consciousness get thrown around. It's made popular to appeal to gullible, to make money. It's kind of losing its credibility. What do you think about that, the way it gets discussed in the mainstream?
So I definitely think there are, quacks, one might say, or people who are trying to make mileage. I think some of them may believe what they are doing. I don't think it's all necessarily people who are trying to pull a fast one on other people, although in some cases I have my doubts. I think in general, if people are asking for money to do anything like this, I would put a serious question on what's going on. I mean, obviously we all have to make a living, but making a living off of things that are extremely speculative seems to me a somewhat dishonest way to do things. I probably get into trouble saying that, but by some people anyway.
And it seems like in general, especially most recently, there seems to be less trust in science. What do you think about that as a scientist?
So the pandemic is interesting because we have had some very polarized response towards sciences, right? So, I mean, as a scientist, as a practicing scientist, I have my own issues with the science community, and certain levels of criticism. But I am not suspicious of the science community in the way that I sometimes hear members of the public being suspicious, as if I think most scientists that certainly most of the scientists that I encountered over the course of my career are sincerely trying to do the best they can to make sense of the world, using, you know, a vast panoply of methods to do so. And you know, there are always issues of ethics, of how and where do you apply these methods and under what circumstances. We've seen some of that with the pandemic too. The very quick approval of the vaccines is somewhat atypical to the way things are normally done. My hope is that in a way, the pandemic has certainly shown the importance of the scientific explanations of things as a way of cutting through the miasma of different kinds of information. So it is a useful tool for making sense of the world, and I think some of that has come out of the pandemic. However, there are clearly parts of the population that have learned to distrust science almost completely. And there it's very hard to turn things around and reintroduce any kind of scientific approach that would be acceptable. And I don't know what the long-term answer to that problem is.
Yeah, I have similar experience with science as well. I think people are trying to do their best. Sometimes the process may be rigid, but it's in some cases it's also required. You can't just offhandedly release something.
No, and for instance, one of the sort of comments I get from people who don't understand science very well is, well, you know, for instance, studies in relation to consciousness and mindfulness, although some of those things are now being studied, but the sort of question of, well, this is a really important problem. Why aren't scientists addressing it? Well, the issue of addressing a problem, it requires methods, and the methods have to be pre-existing. I mean, you can invent new methods, but even the new methods you invent have to be grounded on existing methods. And so you can't just simply launch off into entirely new areas of inquiry without doing all the background work that allows you to incrementally develop the right methods in order to do that. So there's a sort of public opinion kind of idea. Why aren't scientists doing more work in this area? Well, they're trying to, but it's a very slow process to open up new areas of inquiry like that.
It seems like there is a more need of transparency from science because maybe that's something, it's just a speculation, but that's something that's creating a sense of suspicion among the public, because they feel like it's kind of done behind the door and people want to know more.
And there's definitely work that could be done to open up the communication between the world of science and the public. It's also tricky. The typical scientist in an academic career, for instance, is maxed out all the time producing. There's very little extra room to talk to the public. There are people who do it, who make that a priority, but they usually do it by sacrificing to some extent the scientific work that they do. So there's a kind of a trade-off between the time you spend explaining what you're doing to the public and the time you spend actually doing the work. And some people are better at the latter, explaining to the public than others. So it's a tricky thing to work out.
And explaining in itself is a whole new skill. Like I see sometimes in engineering world, we are usually not very good at explaining things.
Yes, actually, I think to some extent, so when I first came into the business, disciplines were fairly closed off from each other. But over the course of my career, I've seen a massive opening up of disciplines to each other independently. So within the world of science, disciplines talking to each other, scientists in one area collaborating with scientists in a completely different area. And to do that, each area of science is built upon assumptions that the scientist in training learns early on. They learn them and they become automatically part of their hidden assumptions about the discipline. So disciplines are grounded in these hidden factors. But when you collaborate with scientists from a different discipline, you have to go back to your basics in what you learned in your own discipline to explain what you're doing to the other scientists from a different domain. And so you've had a lot of these interdisciplinary explanations going on over the last 20 to 30 years, which has actually enhanced the ability of scientists to talk about their work to broader publics, because they've had to do it anyway in their interdisciplinary work. So that's actually a step in the right direction, as it were.
And overall, where do you think this is headed towards? Do you think we are kind of, do you see like classical paradigm moving towards quantum? Or is there
well,
like...
again, the scientific world is already quantum. So there is no distinction between classical and quantum in the actual physical world. The question, I think, is less there than, for instance, the sort of mixing of disciplines. So, for instance, science is still siloed in the science bin, and there's still not enough collaboration with artists, for instance, in my opinion, and perhaps not enough with other disciplines or other approaches, including the spiritual area, although most scientists don't even want to go there. But at least with the arts, there is some discussion going on between the science and the arts. And those, I think, are encouraging signs of an opening up of the scientific disciplines towards a broader understanding and a more inclusive understanding of the world. But it's still an uphill struggle. I have worked, the last 20 years of my career has been working on art-science combination efforts, and they're not easily funded still. So I hope it goes that way.
I've seen, I also wanted to get your take on Western philosophy. I've seen you've been involved in readings of Bateson as well as Gebser. I would love to know, like, what are some of the like what stood out for you in their work?
So Bateson is somebody I read as a young man, just as I was getting into my scientific studies, and has informed most of the, Bateson for me is one of the gods, if you like, of the science world. He's a model for me because like my own interests, he spanned an extremely broad range of scientific disciplines. He did work in psychology, cybernetics, evolutionary biology. He touched on the theological issues. So he did this extraordinary breadth of work. You say Bateson, but of course there are three Batesons: Mary Catherine, his daughter, and Nora Bateson. Both have done also very good work, extraordinary work. Nora Bateson in particular has done remarkable work in the area of ecological and artistic, the sort of linking between ecology and artistic endeavors, rooted in her father's work. So I think the Batesons are brilliant thinkers who take us forward from where we are, because in a lot of ways we're kind of stuck right now. Gebser for me is new. He's not a person I read, although he was certainly writing back in those days, but I wasn't familiar with his work. What I like about Gebser, so I'll maybe get into a little bit of this, but what I like about Gebser's ideas is they're structured, but they're not monolithic structures. Instead of being a series of phases, one which replaces the other, he proposes a series of structures, each of which adds to the other, but doesn't replace the existing structure. So it's a progressive enrichment, if you like, of the understanding of the world, which I like a lot. It doesn't. So I'm sort of fascinated by the idea of consistency and inconsistency. And I think Gebser, although his argument is consistent, it allows room for inconsistency in ways that I think are interesting. So Bateson does it differently. He also is interested in those questions, but does it just differently.
And from your understanding, what's the gist of Western philosophy when they look at the nature of reality? What's kind of the essence when they try to talk about the nature of reality?
So you want me to explain the materialist? So I've done a lot of thinking about this as well. I mean, certainly one of the areas of difficulty I have with the current sort of paradigm of science is its Cartesian roots, right? So its Cartesian roots implicitly built into most modern sciences is the separation of mind and body. Even the neurological sciences, which in principle propose that the brain, if you like, is the link between mind and body, that there is still this distinct functionality of the two elements. So this dualistic perspective, I think, is increasingly in trouble in the current paradigm. There are alternatives. There are a number of alternatives that have been developed, both in the world of philosophy and increasingly in the sciences as well. So again, it's an area that I've been working on in a small way.
Can you share a little bit about your novel and what's the gist of your work? If you have written this novel, Third Testament, if you could give like what's it pointing towards?
Yeah, so because you asked me to if I had any writing that I could share with you, and I thought that one might be relevant and interesting. Um, it's a bit complicated where it came from because it's actually the backstory for a large work that I'm a science fiction work that I'm currently in the process of publishing. The first volumes of it. So it's a 15-volume science fiction saga that explores the far future, but in terms of religion and spiritual questions, as well as scientific and social questions. And in the saga, everybody talks about this document, which is called the Third Testament. But the Third Testament in that era was written 1,000 years earlier, but 1,000 years after our time. So I went and wrote the backstory, which is called Third Testament. So Third Testament is the story of a religious movement that develops in the future, for our far future for us. And the effort there was to find a common thread through all the different religions. And it's difficult to do because if you go to the doxa, to the doctrines of the different religions, each religion is, well, whether or not it's entirely self-consistent, but it has a collection of assumptions about the world, about principles and organizational way of looking at the world, which is self-contained. And it's difficult to develop a system that incorporates all of these different subsystems into a single global system. So I didn't try to do that. What I was interested in is the way that people actually practice religions. So the way a Buddhist practices their faith in everyday life, the way a Catholic practices their faith in everyday life. Because I think what we humans do is we can take on a practice for a while. Like I can take on a Hindu practice, I can take on a Buddhist practice for a certain while. And I can learn and understand the religion from a personal lived in way. So the book Third Testament came about as an attempt to grapple with this issue of an individual who takes on the different practices of different religions over the course of their life, and then eventually constructs a text which pulls the thread together in a way that gives an overview of the different religious perspectives, but focused on the way it's practiced, not on the doctrines of each religion. So, so I was quite pleased with the result because I think it's interesting what I've done with it. But
so does it kind of speak about your own way of how you look at the world?
Yeah. So sort of as I was saying, so each religion. So I think all religions are valid. Even the ones I may disagree with, I think have their own validity. And the fact that human beings have developed all these different religions, I think is absolutely fascinating. And I'm not inclined to sort of accept one over all the others, any one of them as being somehow more true or a better fit or a better description of the world than the others. I'm more interested in their relative strengths and weaknesses, as it were, of the different religions. So it has to do with it has to do with this idea of inconsistency. If you'll notice on my emails, I have a quote at the bottom of my emails. The first right of a human being is to be inconsistent, because I think human beings are fundamentally inconsistent. We require arguments to be consistent. That's a different story. Arguments may need to be consistent, but does a human being have to be consistent? I think we're not built that way at all. So I'm interested in accepting the inconsistency of being human and where that leads us in terms of the ability to open up to sometimes conflicting experiences from different areas, such as different religions.
I think that's quite a powerful insight, Geoffrey, because we have this tendency to put things in a pattern and come up with a formula.
And yeah, the other part of it, of course, is that consistently has to do with argument, and argument has to do with the sayable. Whereas spirituality has to do with the unsayable, things that you cannot say. If you cannot put it into a set of words or into a set of expressions, then you're a different world than the world of argument and consistency. So, and religions address the unsayable. That's essentially the main focus, to a certain extent, of what they do. And to some extent, one could say reality itself is unsayable. All the explanations we have are verbally structured, verbal structures. But the actual lived experience is not necessarily something you can say. So again, I try to be grounded in the speakable world and the unspeakable world, and to develop both in different ways and have the two talk to each other.
And in that process, did it change the way you, when you first began before the novel and now, did it change the way you look at things?
It certainly changed my understanding of religion. So there was also a process involved. I originally started to work on the novel when I was traveling, and I was in Bali. I went to Bali. I had encountered Hinduism before. I had met people who were practicing Hindus, and I had read to some extent about Hinduism. Of course, the way people talk about it is many, many different gods. And so for a Westerner who grew up in the sort of Christian kind of traditions, many gods seems ridiculous to some extent. And it's a hard one to get your head around, as it were. But of course, once I actually started to live and talk and function with people in the Hindu religion, I started to realize that that's not what it is at all. That's a westernized understanding of what's going on. But it's not necessarily the way things are actually organized. There's one view or one kind of numinous function, one divine, and the different gods are different aspects of that divine. So it's a really kind of multiplicity, one inside a multiplicity. And it's a very different understanding of the world. And I kind of felt when I was in Bali and looking at the way things, see, Bali is so interesting because, and you can see that in the way I've talked about it in the novel, is these offerings that they place on the ground throughout the city, because well, I did go into the country to some extent, but the main city of Bali, what's it, Denpasar, anyway, I can't remember the name of it for the moment. But so you have offerings all through the space, little baskets that are woven out of leaves and flowers, and with scents in them, and they're literally scattered on the ground as you walk through it. And each of these offerings has a relationship to the way space is understood in spiritual terms. And so I started to realize, and to the different God aspects of the divine, right? So I started to understand this idea that the one in the multiple kind of gives a grounding for this quest that I was on to link the different religions together. If you start with a place where the multiples are in the one, then you have a grounding to embrace many different religions. So I started with the Hinduism, and then eventually, then I went on my trip. I went to Thailand, which is more Buddhist than Hindu, and I have a long association with Buddhism, even though I haven't actually practiced it. But I have a certain amount of understanding, so I was able to incorporate that. I live in Quebec, which is a Catholic environment. The main religion here is Catholic. And so I've spent, several decades moving and working with people who are mostly in the Catholic traditions. And there's, Protestant as well. So it's sort of a progress of progressively deepening my understanding of the relationships between these different spiritual activities and what they have to say to this larger picture that I've been developing. So it's hard to pinpoint any given point at which my understanding of the world changed, but as a global process, it certainly led to this. I mean, this idea of the inconsistent collections, that the unspeakable and the speakable, all of these kinds of insights have come out of that work.
And do you think it's possible for different religions to find a common ground?
I think if they focus on practice, they could. I think if they focus on doctrine, it's hard because each religion has its own self. I don't know. I hesitate to say consistent because I don't think religions are entirely consistent activities, but they are certainly self-contained understanding of the world, and it's difficult to be. It's difficult to accept at the same time that there is a one unique God for which Jesus died on the cross, and there is a God who has multiple aspects, and there's no God at all. It's just a question of naming. Each of these different approaches has a very different understanding of the world. I mean, that was one of the things I learned from Bateson. Bateson talked about the idea of play, and what he said about play is the process of taking on an activity as if it were true, not assuming it's true, but treating it as if it were true, and then functioning within that system as if it were true. And then at the end of the play, you pull away and you say, okay, that was that experience as if it were true. Now I'm going to enter into a different experience as if it were true. And in a sense, that's what I've been doing with these religions. I'm treating each religion as an as if exercise to enter into it, explore it, and then eventually pull away and then look at the different religions.
And I could be wrong about this, but it seems like more and more people, it doesn't seem like religion has a strong hold on people anymore as it used to be. More and more people are in this, like, for example, I'm not religious. And I could be speculating, but it seems like more and more people are like that, where they are not signed up to any particular religion.
So this is a good question. I mean, the statistics say that there are more people involved in religion now than there were, say, 10 years ago. The adherence to religion is increasing, not decreasing. There was a period where it was declining, but it's now entered a phase where it's growing. Yeah, so that's a complicated question because we live in troubled times. And I think in troubled times, people turn more to religion as a way of giving structure to their lives. I think the period when religion declined was a period where world context was relatively stable, and there was less sort of trouble going around in the world, although there were certainly places where that was going on. And there, people eventually slowly drift away from, structured religions and work on more their own development. So I think it's part of an evolutionary process in the broader social context. Whether or not the increase in religion today will continue in the future if the world context stabilizes again, possibly it will go back into decline at that point. My sense in the long term, and my science fiction saga is kind of based on that idea, is that religion is here to stay, but it will eventually be the main focus for a minority rather than a majority. But the questions of the numinous, the divine, will inform decisions about the world independently in a way of religion, because the numinous is part of the world, whether or not even I don't know whether purely atheist would think that, but I think certainly my understanding of the world is the numinous is part of it. Whether you call that the divine or a god or something, I don't know, but it's a grounding as part of our experience of the world. And I think the sort of approach that says there is no God, there is no spirituality, it's not about that, is actually a kind of rejection phase rather than a true acceptance of the human experience in its complexity. I don't know if that's clear, but
I think that's quite interesting that there's no like one trend about losing an interest in religion. It seems like it changes depending on what's happening in the world.
Yeah, so for instance, in my science fiction saga, I posit a link between changing technological conditions or social conditions, if you like, and the kinds of religions that become more important. So the idea is, well, I won't talk about the particular context there, but so you have this sort of argument. I read a book last year called The Axial Age that looks at the sort of period between 500 B.C. and the birth of Jesus Christ. That's a kind of period. Is called an axial age because 3 of the 4 major monotheistic religions came into being in that period. And they seem to have come into being partly in response to particular social conditions that were present in the world at that time. Now, they've been persistent over time. They've persisted throughout the 2 millennia since then. So it's not you can't entirely tag it to the social conditions of that time because the conditions have changed. But there is a kind of loose argument that you can relate different social structures to different religious concepts, if you like.
It would be funny if a new religion pops up around technology based.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's technology per se, but for instance, in the book, in the Third Testament, the one is a context in which people are able to function and live in a hard vacuum. And so the attachment to planetary surfaces loses its hold on humanity. And with the disappearance of habitats on planetary surfaces, the the idea of community starts to shift, the idea of what a body is starts to shift, and with it comes ideas about religion that are more focused on emergent properties of the world rather than the omniscient argument about religion. You know, the sort of omniscient, all knowing, all seeing, always existing God, to the idea of a God that is coming into being as we go. So it's a particular argument about this. But.
What's you obviously, while doing such work and explorations, you may have had more clarity on the nature of reality, as well as what is life, the idea of consciousness. Like how do you put all this together?
So I mentioned so we talked about quantum phenomena and the interpretation problem, and so sort of modern science has this idea that consciousness, so to sort of caricaturize the idea, that this idea is consciousness emerges from complexity, right? The more complex structures evolve among animals and so forth, eventually consciousness emerges as a kind of complexity. As a caricature, some have said, essentially what that idea is the world is dead until these conscious structures emerge. So in a sense, consciousness is born from a dead world. And the alternative way of looking at it is that the world is so this idea that consciousness is built into the basic structure of space-time, and that it comes from the bottom up, so that you know, Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, his ideas, which are not they're very interesting ideas and were groundbreaking in this area, but there are other approaches to this idea now as well. But he had this idea that atoms had a kind of minuscule consciousness, and that if you put them together in the right structures, then you would get this emergent property. So this sort of increasing complexity argument about consciousness is actually coherent with the idea that consciousness is built into the universe from the ground up. And I tend to, over the years, so these are interpretations. These are not, there's no scientific evidence one way or the other about this. Most scientists, well, a certain number of scientists assume that the world is dead and consciousness comes out of it. I'm not convinced of that. I think that the other idea that the consciousness may be built in from the ground up may be a better way to go, and helps explain the problem of the emergence of consciousness in ways that are interesting. So I'm tend towards that approach, but as I say, they're interpretive rather than evidentially based ideas.
I think this is a good point to bring up Sri Aurobindo's evolutionary theory, and in your own context of like, what do you think that it's somehow linked with consciousness, and is there possibility of evolution based on those type of ideas of consciousness?
So I think Aurobindo's ideas about the role of evolution in the development of higher, I have problems with the higher argument, but anyway, more spiritual, more divine, more involved consciousness. so I think the role of evolution in that is interesting, but it's so bound up with the sort of global system of Aurobindo's thought. Aurobindo has a largely consistent understanding of the world. It's an entire world belief about how things are structured, organized, and how how the divine is related to the human, and how the human gets towards the divine, and so forth. So I'm still totally fascinated with Aurobindo's approach to things. I've been reading I've been reading a number of texts by Aurobindo, but the one I like the most is The Secret of the Veda, which is a text which essentially it's some of his translations of the Rig Veda, so the Vedic texts which sit underneath Hindu religion, around which the Hindu religion is constructed. And he didn't translate, or I don't know if he translated the whole thing, but The Secret of the Veda is certain translation of certain verses and commentary on those translations, on the verses. And reading The Secret of the Veda in parallel with reading other texts like The Life Divine or The Synthesis of Yoga, one gets to this understanding that many of Aurobindo's ideas were actually grounded in the Vedas, and they came from the Vedas. He reorganized them into this system that he developed, this integral yoga, but they are fundamentally rooted in ideas already present in the Vedas. And I must say that so I find this, the grounding in the Vedas fascinating. The Vedic ideas are very, very interesting. The evolutionary approach is more Aurobindo's value added onto the Vedas rather than what's actually built in there. And it's again an idea that I like, but the idea of evolution, the way Aurobindo deals with it, has to do with reincarnation. It's a follow through from an understanding of the divine in terms of reincarnation, that we actually come back at different stages as we evolve as spirits, if you like. And my problem is that I'm not sure that I agree with reincarnation. So, so I have issues with parts of Aurobindo, even though I enjoy reading and learning about it, because I'm not entirely, I don't embrace all of the aspects that sit on inside that approach.
What I like,
I'm inconsistent.
I actually really like that, because you because there is usually a tendency to find a common ground and to figure out a pattern, like this is how it's going to work for everyone, and maybe at some point we'll have to accept that it may not be same for everyone. We all are different, and we all are like inconsistent.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that's the main issue I have with Aurobindo, and to some extent that's sort of this thinking about Aurobindo came from this interview. So in my preparing for the interview, I've started to think about, because we've been planning this interview for about 4 or 5 months. We've discussed it, so I've had time to think through some of these issues, and so I've started to sort of draw back a little bit and say, well, what is it actually that I now understand about Aurobindo's writing, if I sort of step back and look at it, because I've been in the middle of it, too close to it to really be able to pull back. But now I have read enough, I think, now that I can begin to get a sense of how it fits within my own ideas, my larger ideas. And it comes back to this issue that I think Aurobindo's ideas, while extraordinary, are focused on a self-contained understanding of the world. And I don't think humans function well in self-contained systems. So I'm much more interested in, but Aurobindo, to be fair, there are a lot of groundings in his work for broadening the scope. He's very inclusive. And so you don't have to say stuck in the self-contained aspects of Aurobindo's thought. You can dip in and use sections to to drive other ideas. And he was written in a way to do that. It's one of the strengths of his writing. But that's where I am now, is struggling with the sort of reopening up Aurobindo in the context of other possibilities.
Recently, when I spoke with Debashish, you may be you may know,
yeah.
He talked about how Sri Aurobindo's work, it's more about integral approach, where the person decides what's the perfect goal for them, and for each person it could be different, like what's
there is.
And each person decides what's the approach to get to that perfect goal. So it's kind of like in a way, he kind of is accepting that it's different for different people, and you have to kind of explore and try to get to your goal, what you think is perfection. For some, it may be peace. For some, it may be about a union, or some, it may be about power. So he kind of addresses that problem. I'm not sure if in that way he addresses the problem of inconsistency.
I think you're right. I think one can view Sri Aurobindo's work as a kind of toolbox. A toolbox in which you can dip in for guidance on your spiritual journey, but you don't have to take the whole thing. You can pick and choose, maybe not entirely, but you can, because there are certain ideas that are, I think, more central to his understanding of the world. So for instance, one of the surprises for me in diving into Aurobindo is the importance he gives to the body in terms of a spiritual journey, unlike certain religions that devalue the body to some extent. Aurobindo's approach is to say, without the body, there's nothing. So it's a very immanent, incarnated kind of approach to a relationship with the divine, which is another aspect of it that I really like. Can you pick and choose and say, well, I prefer the transcendental approach and the body for me is not so important? Probably you could, but it seems to me that the immanent aspect of Aurobindo's thought is fairly central to his understanding. And so I think there are areas of the thought you can't so easily pick and choose, right?
So what is your take on evolutionary theory? Do you think it's possible is there such a thing as like an advanced consciousness? And is it possible
I think so. I think so. But I'm not sure that my understanding is not tied to evolution in the sense of reincarnating spirits, but in the sense of the evolution of humanity as a collective. So I think that as we evolve as a collective, we will arrive at communal states of consciousness that exceed the individual and that constitute a kind of, maybe not divine, but in that direction, they're moving in that direction. Certainly in the science fiction saga that I've been working on, that is the kind of where things are tending towards, is this idea of the emergence of a divine entity as humans evolve. as a collective, not individually through cycles of reincarnation. Yeah.
And I'm when I was looking into Sri Aurobindo's work, it seems like he more points towards like how emerging out of that duality seems like the I don't want to say that's the step, but like evolving out of that ego-based dualistic consciousness seems he sees that as like a big step forward for evolving consciousness and step the more like a collective uh, he calls it supermind, like tuning into.
I don't know whether it's supermind. I'm not sure that I fully understand supermind the way Aurobindo describes it. So it's a very difficult concept for me to get into because I don't think I really understand it very well. But I have written, and I have another unpublished manuscript where I'm sort of looking at the world structure and the context which we're in currently. And I think that humanity as a whole is passing through a kind of crucible right now. The pandemic is, for me, a bump inside a forge that's in the process of coming into being. It's a large bump, but all the different bumps are, so the economic collapse of 2008 was the first major bump, if you like, relatively minor compared to the pandemic, but and there are a series of these catastrophes that are happening. I don't think the pandemic is the last. I think it's, if anything, one of the earlier ones. But I think through this process of crises, humanity is going through a change in the way we function as a collective. I'm hopeful about the results because the fact that we're also at the limits of what the planet can support. So we know that if we don't figure things out, we're dooming ourselves to extinction, because if we can't figure out a way how to manage the planet's resources without killing it, we're goners anyway. So it's a kind of, we either figure this out in order to get to the next stage, or the discussion is moot anyway. So you can take this destructive doomsday approach and say, well, there's no good even worrying about it because we're all goners anyway. But you could say, if we focus on the positive approach, maybe we can bootstrap ourselves into a different state of existence if we do it right. And so there's an opportunity to do something with that. So that also is an argument for the fact that we're in a kind of transformative period right now in terms of the way that we function as a collective. And I think that may be a evolution in a way. It's maybe more revolution than evolution, but it is an evolutionary function, if you like.
So what is your evolutionary theory, if there is, what does that look like? Would it be more like stepping into a collective existence? If you could expand more on that.
So I think we're going to learn how to, okay. For a collective functionality to collective to function, one has to bring to the surface the dark sides of the collective. Just as an individual, in order to progress as an individual, you have to bring the dark sides of your own self to the surface. In the collective, you have to do that too. So I think to some extent, the extremisms that are going on in the current world, both religious extremism, fanaticism of various sorts, terrorism, and these kinds of things, They're part of the dark underbelly of humanity that is coming to the surface. Why is it coming to the surface? Because we are now at the limits of what the planet can support, and we are in this highly interconnected society, but which is actually a result of coming to the limits of what the planet can do. And so it's this collective state that we've gotten ourselves into, and becoming aware of the difficult things and learning how to manage them in intelligent ways. So this idea of collective intelligence, right, that has emerged, we've already seen that. The big problems of the planet, the managing the ecosystem, can't be done piecemeal. It has to be done in a systems way, and it has to be done collectively. It can't be done by individuals acting. Even the best leaders in the world cannot do it. We have to act together. So we have to learn to do those things. And we're not very good at that yet. We're still not very good at doing intelligent systems-wide transformations to deal with the larger problems. But we're going to have to learn it to get through this stage. So I think that bootstraps humanity into a state. Now, what exactly it looks like, it's hard exactly to work out, but it's a kind of, maybe it's legal structures. I think the shift away from purely monetary based economy is part of it too. We've seen the emergence of, is it S Corp structures? So corporations whose modus operandi is no longer purely profit based, but can be socially oriented as well. And we have a social economy that's grown enormously in the last few decades. And so we're seeing a kind of socioeconomic shift away from profit-based structures towards something that includes those structures, but has a much broader base. And that, to me, is again a movement towards a more intelligent way of dealing with the worldwide issues that we have. So the new society will have more intelligence built into it, both in terms of the way it's structured, in the way we function with each other, in our recognition of values. So, but again, it has to be, we have to learn to manage the inconsistency, and not by ironing it out. So I'm not sure what the result is, but I think it is a step into a new possibility, a new possible way of functioning. And and people say, well, the world is the same old, same old. There is nothing new under the sun. I think we're in a time where, if that's true, we're dead. So I prefer to assume that new structures, new modes of functioning can come into being, and that we are in the process of learning how to do that.
Yeah, I think next few years are kind of crucial in a way, like to see how things unfold. We are in an interesting time right now.
We are may you live in interesting times. I think that may be a politically incorrect statement, because it's often ascribed as a Chinese curse, but I'm not sure that that's the right way to talk about it. But
you have also looked into synthesis of yoga as well as Savitri.
yes.
I bring that up because I've not looked deeply into it, but I wanted to understand your take on how that kind of fits in with the overall philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, because you have obviously spent a lot of time into it, so it would be really valuable to know how that kind of fits in.
So it is an interesting question, because so if you you can read Aurobindo as a logical argument. You can try to read it that way. Certainly, a lot of people do try to do that. So it's constructed, like the synthesis of yoga is constructed as a set of arguments. But if you read it that way, you're going to miss the point in a way, because what Sri Aurobindo is trying to do is engender us change in the way you experience the world through his writings. And you don't get there by just engaging intellectually with the argument. So this is why Savitri is such an interesting text, because Savitri, you cannot read it intellectually. You have to read it by turning off the intellect and engaging with the poetry and with the sort of deeper, and it's also voice-based. So, I'm involved in an exercise where we're reading Savitri aloud, and reading the text aloud engages with a kind of, it's almost a ritualistic kind of, it's an invocation in a sense. So it engages with the parts of ourselves that are underneath the intellectual, that are more involved in the sensory experience, the auditive experience, the body-based experience. And so Savitri engages with us at those levels and not just at the level of the intellect and the mind, which makes it a very, very rewarding activity to engage in. The synthesis of yoga, which is more intellectually organized, you can fall into the trap of viewing it as an argument. But again, if you do that, you miss the other parts of the text, which, because the way Aurobindo writes, his writing is very, very dense, it's very rich. It's like a rich tapestry of a million ideas that are condensed down into very, very tight sections, but with a lot of different ideas that are all threaded through. And it's hard to read intellectually, because if you were to stop and try and understand each sentence, which you would have to do if you were trying to get it intellectually, you would never get through the text. So you have to let go of the intellectual understanding in order to read it, and engage with the text as something that is inducing a different state of consciousness. So again, the synthesis of yoga has that property, that function that's really interesting. But my favorite is still The Secret of the Veda. I like The Secret of the Veda best, and then I like Savitri, and then I like Synthesis of Yoga. And the Life Divine at the bottom, because, well, it was the first one I read. I'm not sure it was a good introduction to Sri Aurobindo's writings, but it was the one I had. And I don't think I understood a lot of it when I read it, so.
Was his work the main thing when you came across when you explored Eastern philosophy, or were there any other thinkers that you found interesting from the Eastern?
So I've read some others. I've read, Tao Te Ching, for that matter. I've read bits of the Quran. I've read, well, the Bible is an Eastern text, actually. So I was thinking about it. Eastern philosophy. I certainly know a lot more about Eastern theology than I know about Eastern philosophy. I'm not sure about the philosophy as such. I'd be hard-picked to name an Eastern philosopher distinct from theological issues.
Yeah, I kind of use those words interchangeably, which I shouldn't, because
Well, then maybe they're more integrated into the Eastern approach and you can't address one without the other, but in the West, they're quite distinct, right? Most philosophers do not address theological issues. And a few do, but often with a certain level of askance from the others when they do so. So,
so from what you read, what was the understanding about like how does the Eastern philosophy look at the nature of reality?
I'm not sure that I know. I'm not sure I know enough about it. I mean, I read Fritz of Capra and these kinds of what was it, the Dancing Woolly Masters? That's another writer. I can't remember who that is. So these kinds of books that look at quantum physics and its relationship to Eastern philosophy as a kind of mirroring thing. So maybe Eastern philosophy is more rooted in an understanding of the world that's close to what we think of in quantum terms than Western philosophy. But Western philosophy has changed. The classics in Western philosophy is one thing, but the moderns is very different story. So, Deleuze, even James, who is a bit older, Merleau-Ponty, these kinds of philosophers have a much more grounded, non-dualistic understanding of the world than do the classical Western philosophers. So I know more about Western philosophy than I do about Eastern. I'm a bit hard put to speak intelligently about the Eastern.
Were there any similarities or and differences? What were the highlights of the similarities between those two, as well as differences that you noticed? Although I know like you didn't get too much into the Eastern thing.
Because again, those books, I read them a long time ago, and I'm not even sure I could easily identify those things. I'm possibly not the right person to talk about those things with. I think they're good questions. I just don't know how to address them. Yeah.
And is there anything I missed out today that you would want to share?
I have made notes, but I think we did cover most of the things. No, I think we covered most of the things. Yeah, I think we covered pretty well all of my notes.
Sorry?
I think we covered all of my notes, so.
If someone wants to find out more about you, is the geoffreyedwards.org, is that your website? Is that the right website?
Yeah, that's the one that I have right now. So I'm in the process of looking into, so we haven't talked about that, but I identify as gender fluid, and I am in the process of looking at changing my written or public name from Geoffrey to Geoffrey Jen Edwards. So I'm probably going to change my website soon to reflect that change. So
it would be different.
Hmm?
Your website link would also be different.
So the name would change slightly. It's a bit awkward to change it because, but at this point, I have no published books at this point. They're about to start, so it's a good time to change it before they get published. And I do have another site that talks, but it's an older site that talks about my scientific work a bit more. It's think it's the CRG site. Not sure what it's called now. It's been a while, so. Because for 15 years I was a Canada Research Chair, and I had a site for that work. If I can find it anyway. No, it's going to be CRC. No. Yeah, I'm going to find it here. Cognitivegeomatics.blogspot.com.
I wasn't able to hear you clearly.
So it's cognitivegeomatics.blogspot.com. It just gives a kind of summary of some of the scientific work I did over the years, but it's not up to date. It's old by about 5 years now. So
I'll include both links in the description.
yeah.
Thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed talking to you, and I think it's really impressive how far you have gone in your inquiry. It's rare to find someone like that where you can talk about such a wide range of.
I think I addressed most of the things that.
Yeah,
I am rather passionate about the subject, so.